From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Westin. We're continuing to follow the fallout from last week's attack on the Capitol, with now President Trump banned from Twitter and Facebook, and the social media stocks are down on the news. For an assessment of the effects on their businesses, welcome now Emily Chang. She is, of course, anchor of Bloomberg Tech. Emily, thank you so much for being with us. So I saw the stock was down pointedly this morning. Is that because they were supported that much by President Trump and his followers?
So look, President Trump had 88 million followers on Twitter. There is no question that that drove a lot of traffic on the site itself. If you ask any Twitter executive, though, they would talk about how broad Twitter is across the world, that it doesn't just depend on President Trump. But, you know, quarter after quarter, we would ask the Twitter executives, when President Trump is perhaps no longer president, does that impact your service? Another reason the stock could be down today is that we are expecting, because of these decisions, that the president and potentially a number of different Republican lawmakers are going to make Section 230 and railing against big tech a big part of the president's last few days in office. Obviously, he is incensed by this. He's not the only one that has been cut off from Twitter. But what is interesting, of course, is the debate that has now been ignited around the world about the power of these platforms. You know, Twitter has banned the president indefinitely. That's going to put pressure on Facebook to ban the president indefinitely as well. He's been suspended on Facebook, and Mark Zuckerberg has said that will last at least the next couple of weeks. But what happens after the inauguration? Will there be more pressure then to ban President Trump or citizen Trump from the platform as well? And, you know, unquestionably, the debate has begun about the power of these platforms. If Twitter and Facebook can, in a second, just silence the president, cut him off from his followers, is that simply too much power? Is the problem not just the president himself, but the power of the platforms as well?
Yeah, at the same time, Emily, it's not limited to social media, strictly speaking. Amazon got hit because they actually took Parler down, right?
Absolutely. That is huge. Amazon Web Services over the weekend, in speaking with Parler, warned them that they were seeing violent content on there, that Parler didn't have a good enough plan to moderate that content. So now Amazon Web Services has cut off Parler as well. That means Parler doesn't really have anywhere to go, at least for the next few days. They've said they're going to be offline for as much as a week. Certainly they can find another web hosting platform, but it just goes to show the power that these companies have. And I just want to point out that there isn't a legal issue here. These are private companies that can do business with whoever they want, but there is a principle issue. You know, are these platforms truly neutral platforms, or does this instance prove that they are not truly neutral platforms? I mean, if you look at how these decisions are made, it came down to Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey, two people, two men who simply had the power to decide whether the president would be on the platform or not. And that is something that certainly needs to be debated, and we need to be asking the question, is this appropriate? And what's next? What will the consequences of these decisions be?
Emily, thank you so much for spending time with us today. And you want to make sure to watch Emily's program, Bloomberg Tech, this evening at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. The role of social media in last week's constitutional crisis was only one of the important issues being re-examined in the wake of the attack on the Capitol. Welcome now, former Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, a partner at Paul Weiss. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. Let's start with the social media part, because there are a lot of national security issues raised by what we saw last Wednesday. How big a threat is social media to national security when it's used the way it was?
David, I don't want to take any particular company to task, but social media, the ability to push out fake news, extremist views, is frankly a large reason for why we are where we are today in our politics, in our domestic security situation. Something like 70% of Republicans, according to polls, believe that the election was stolen and that there was fraud in the election. I'm waiting to see the poll that a certain percentage of Americans believe that last week's attack on the Capitol was the fault of Antifa, and there is absolutely no evidence of that. And so, you know, when you and I grew up, there were conventional news sources from which we got all the same set of facts, out of which we'd form our own opinions about the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement and the like. Now, because of social media, because of this information highway, people can go to sources of so-called news that do no more than reaffirm their own paranoias, their own biases, their own prejudices, and their own suspicions. And that has been a big driver of the divisiveness and the ugliness in our politics for the last several years.
Jay, at the same time, is there a danger of overreacting? I mean, we've seen this sometimes in crises in this country where we react to the last problem, we overreact. Let me give you a stark example. One person's extreme expression might be another person's Arab Spring. I mean, social media is very important in Arab Spring. How do we protect our own homeland from the ills that could come from social media without shutting down an Arab Spring?
Excellent question, David. Very often, a crisis atmosphere is a poor atmosphere in which to make policy. I have been saying now for several years that government agencies, national security agencies, need to resist the political push or the impulse to dive into trying to regulate social media, political debate on the internet. Think about what certain people in office today would do if they could deem something fake news and therefore impose government restrictions on the ability of the internet to repeat it. And so we've got to be careful when it comes to government restrictions on political debate, political speech, which is why the action on President Trump's accounts was extraordinary, but probably overdue, frankly.
At the same time, I wonder if there's actually a positive good for law enforcement, national security authorities, of having an open web. That is to say, if really we do drive these people off of Twitter and Facebook and maybe even Parler, they may go to the dark web, and it might be harder for our national security forces to really monitor what they're up to.
There is that offsetting concern. Very definitely the ability to monitor extremist views, communications, plotting, terrorist plotting is a valuable law enforcement tool. And you're correct. Very often when you prohibit something, you make it more difficult. You just drive it to another corner, and law enforcement struggles to keep up.
Going beyond social media, we have an inauguration coming up next week now. How do we make sure we don't have some sort of problem the way we did last week? I mean, what went wrong and what steps should be taken to really make sure we're secure on the Capitol?
David, when I was Secretary of Homeland Security, I had the responsibility for the inauguration 4 years ago, for the security of the inauguration 4 years ago. In my time as Secretary, I also had the responsibility for the security of 3 State of the Union addresses in the U.S. Capitol, 2 presidential political conventions, 3 UN General Assembly sessions, 1 papal visit. It can be done. There is something called an NSSE, National Special Security Event. The inauguration is an NSSE. Political conventions are NSSEs. And when you declare something an NSSE, there's a certain level of security preparation that kicks in. And there's literally a checklist of things you go through to prevent any sort of penetration of the event from land, sea, air, and cyberspace. That failed to happen last week for reasons that we will learn at some point. Those responsible for the security of last week's event in the Congress did not anticipate the security challenges that they ended up facing. This could have been prohibited. We know how to protect the perimeter of the U.S. Capitol.
Not to be flip about this at all, Mr. Secretary, but do we know how to protect the security of the country from the President of the United States himself? I mean, there's a raging debate right now, as you know, in Washington about whether this man should remain in office because some people are concerned in the next 10 days something could happen. How concerned are you about that possibility?
I am very concerned. Our domestic security situation right now is very tense. It should be on high alert. David, the very, very sad fact is that there exists in this country a strand of racism, intolerance, bigotry, anti-Semitism that has for years existed under a rock. Frankly, our political leaders, President Trump, has enabled that group, has emboldened that group by saying you're special people, you're good people, and basically allowed them to come out from under their rock. And we saw that last week. That one of the things that I think is important now, and I'm glad to have this opportunity to talk to the business community, David, is that there are others involved in this who frankly aided and abetted this. There are people now who believe that by pandering to Trump's base, by pandering to this aspect of his base, it works to their own political benefit. And I think the rest of us in this country need to push back on that and say, no, you don't. Don't try that. And the business community in particular, I believe, has a large voice in that.
Has the business community had a voice actually in supporting President Trump and some of his extreme statements? I mean, are there things the business community should have done or should not have done that would have been more beneficial to the country overall?
Well, I was very pleased with the statement that came out, I think, last week or the week before from CEOs saying we need to support our democracy. We need to support our Constitution. There's a role to play for business leaders in this country in our democracy. Sometimes those of us in business and law and big law, where I sit here in Midtown Manhattan, underestimate our own influence and our own importance in our democracy. But we are in a position to influence the behavior of people in Washington who are looking at today's politics and saying to themselves, hey, maybe there's something in here for me. And one of the things that was so frightening is that there was a judgment, and I'll call them out, by Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley to pander to this group for their own political benefit. We have, now that we've seen the disastrous consequences of last week, we have to push back firmly on any inclination to go in that direction.
So here's the big question, I think, Mr. Secretary. How can we, on the one hand, make sure that this never happens again, that we send the strongest possible signal, whether impeachment or 25th Amendment, something else, that this can never happen again, on the one hand, and on the other hand, bring the country back together again? Because there are some legitimate concerns of some of the people who support President Trump, who have supported him. There are legitimate issues there that we can't just ignore, I think.
That is true. We cannot ignore the very large extent to which Americans, a number of Americans, feel disenfranchised, believe that the government does not work for them. That is a large part of that 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump in November. They cannot be overlooked. They cannot be disregarded. But there's an element also in this country of bigotry, ignorance, intolerance, that we have to rebuke as loudly as possible. We saw it up close and personal. We saw the damage it can do. We saw what it could have done had it been allowed to go further. All Americans, Republicans, Democrats, progressives, liberals, need to denounce this as a real threat to our very democracy. Not since the War of 1812, David, have we seen a run on the U.S. Capitol in that way. That's truly frightening.
It certainly was. No question about that. Thank you so very much for being with us. Always enjoy speaking with you. That is Jay Johnson. He's former Secretary of Homeland Security. We've already talked about the effects on social media stocks of the ban on President Trump. It's time now to get an overall look at the markets. And for that, we turn to Kaylee Lines.
Well, David, we are around the highs of the session right now, but even that still leaves us in negative territory for the S&P 500. It's down about 0.4%. And as you were just discussing, some of the biggest drags within the index are tech companies caught up in that controversy, the likes of Apple and Facebook, the biggest point decliners in the S&P 500. But the other thing to blame for the weakness may just be taking a bit of a breather here. We did end the last week at record highs despite everything that transpired. A lot of frenzied bullish speculation, valuations looking quite stretched. So maybe just an unwinding, a touch of that today. The other thing to really pay attention to is the dollar, because despite call after call for dollar weakness in 2021, the dollar is actually stronger for a third day in a row when it comes to the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index. It's up about 0.4% right now. That in part is due to the demand created by higher yields, with the 10-year yield back above 1.1% right now. Finally, just want to touch on Bitcoin, David, because I don't know if a bubble is popping. It's probably too soon to make that call, but the action over the past 2 days does not send a great signal. Bitcoin is down more than 20% in today's session. Adding on to the losses from over the weekend, right now it's trading around the 31,000 level. It was at 42,000 just on Friday, so this has unwound quite rapidly. Scott Meinert over at Guggenheim, who told Bloomberg a few weeks ago Bitcoin could eventually reach 400,000, says its parabolic rise is unsustainable in the near term and that it's time to take some money off the table. And clearly, there's investors doing that today, David.
Yeah, although we've seen this play before, as I recall, it's shooting up and then shooting down again. Thank you so very much to Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, last week was really one for the history books. Amazing developments in Capitol Hill. At the same time, the markets really set new record highs. They really didn't pay much attention to politics and what was really a constitutional crisis. Maybe looking forward to the fact that we actually have a narrow majority for the Democrats in both the House and the Senate, really giving rise to expectations that President-elect Biden will be able to do more with his economic plan than had been thought. We heard from the president-elect on Friday, and he was asked specifically about a stimulus package, and he said that he will announce an overall stimulus package that will include many, many elements on this Thursday. But in the course of that, he said the price tag would be high, and he mentioned it would be in the trillions of dollars. And he may actually now have the votes to get that done, specifically if it is related in particular to the virus and vaccination, the need for vaccinations. There's a lot of clamor in the country to give whatever resources we need to, including to the states and the local governments, to make sure that we can get the vaccine done. At the same time, we've seen the yield curve steepen, and one of the questions that's being asked right now is, why is it steepening? There are good reasons for it to steepen and some that are not so good. If, in fact, it's steepening because there's an expectation of future growth in the economy, well, that's a good thing. We want that to happen. On the other hand, if it's merely a matter of we're going to pump more money into the system, that may not be so good. As we know, we've talked to Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, and he has said, listen, giving people a lot more money in their pockets, and it looks right now like President Trump may well get that $2,000 payment going out to people, getting money in their pocket won't necessarily help much because they don't have a way to spend it. They can't go out to restaurants. They can't go out to spend in shops. And so if that's true, it may not get done what we want to get done. So to take us through exactly how the markets are reacting to this complex set of circumstances, we welcome Paul Christopher. He's Wells Fargo Investment Institute Head of Global Market Strategy. So, Paul, I've been doing a poor man's job of your job, so now take us back and tell us what you think is going on. What are we going to see in terms of stimulus, and what effect is it likely to have?
Yeah, so the stimulus will really help the economy cushion the blow of a rough first quarter. But after the first quarter, we don't think stimulus is really going to do a lot. It's private spending that really is going to make the difference, and for that we need to see the vaccines increase their rate of rollout. But having said that, a Biden presidency with a Congress that is at least somewhat favorable to spending initiatives could introduce new items like infrastructure, could introduce items like an expanded ACA, Affordable Care Act, to increase coverage of Americans to for health insurance reasons. And those sorts of things could add to private spending that we expect around mid-year to begin. And then the two of them together could give the economy a strong boost into year-end.
So let me give you two possible notes of caution here. One would be we might overheat it. We might actually get inflation coming back. I know we've been talking about it for years, hasn't happened, but you could overheat it. Another note of caution is it possible that with the shift in the Congress, you also could get new taxes that the business would not like very much?
Yeah, good questions, both on the minds of investors. As to the inflation issue, yeah, you probably will see a little bit of a pickup in inflation from extremely low levels, but inflation coming back to, say, 2% or around 2% would not be harmful for the stock market, would not be harmful for the economy, and certainly would not get the Fed, we think, off of its current interest rate policy, which is extremely and aggressively supportive for the economy. In terms of taxes, it takes time to do tax reform, no matter who's in control. Remember 2017, the Republicans had control of all of the chambers of Congress and the White House, and it still took them 6 or 7 months once they finally got to it. Now, you might say the Biden administration will start sooner. We would disagree with that. We think the Biden administration will prioritize spending first because, think about it, you've still got an economy that's trying to come out of a pandemic. Do you want to try to impose tax increases broadly right away and damage the economy and risk your chances in the next congressional election? Or do you want to wait a bit? And the longer you wait, the longer it takes to get things done, and then the closer you get to election. So we don't think tax policy is really going to change very much in this particular Congress. It might in the next.
Paul, to what extent do investors pay attention to who will be running the ship in Washington? Certainly we know President-elect Biden, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, but what about the cabinet appointments? Because one thing we know pretty much for sure with new configuration of the Senate is that we will get confirmation of the picks. Do investors see the picks that have been made at the cabinet level as relatively moderate and therefore encouraging?
Yeah, we've already seen some moderately left of center picks. Janet Yellen, for example, was the key one, and markets liked that pick as well. Brian Deese to head the National Economic Council, that's also going to be another one that the markets are not going to dislike very much. He has an emphasis on climate change, but we're not expecting to see the Green New Deal or anything like it. It's going to be much toned down. And I would say that in any additional appointments that the Biden administration may make are going to have to take account of the fact that you might have a slight edge in the Senate and a slight edge in the House, but certainly not enough to approve very extreme people. And so we think moderate left of center is likely across the board going forward.
So, Paul, a lot of talk about a bubble or going too far, getting too fast. As I say, we've had a lot of equity markets setting records last week. Are investors worried we are going too far, particularly on valuations?
Yes, there are a lot of investors who are concerned that markets are a little bit stretched. They look stretched to us. But that's maybe a shorter-term phenomenon. Markets have had some pretty good news to price in since the beginning of November. And yes, you could get a little bit extended here. Some consolidation is likely at some point. But we would ask investors to keep their eye on the end of this year. Again, we think that combination of public and private spending is going to drive earnings growth. So use those pullbacks to put cash to work and incrementally allocate.
Paul, thank you so much. Paul Christopher of Wells Fargo. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, besides the crisis in the Capitol, the big issue really is COVID-19 and the vaccination program. Coming up next, we're going to talk to Dr. Mark Broome. He's Houston Methodist CEO about what's going on in the state of Texas when it comes to vaccinations. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. As compelling as the events in Washington have been, in the long term, the course of the pandemic and the vaccination program will likely have more of an effect on most Americans. We spoke on Friday with Dr. Steve Corwin. He is head of New York Presbyterian, who said that over 90% of his healthcare workers have now been inoculated.
We're probably over 90%, and we're very close to being able to move to the next populations. But I still think we have hesitancy in certain groups of our employees, particularly our service workers, transporters, registrars, and we're spending a lot of time and effort with those groups to educate, to inform.
For an update on what's going on in Texas instead of New York, we welcome now the head of another major metropolitan hospital center. Dr. Mark Broome is CEO of Houston Methodist, ranked the #1 hospital in Texas for 8 years in a row. So, Dr. Broome, always great to have you with us. Talk about your friend, Steve Corwin. How are you doing at Houston Methodist compared to how they're doing at New York Presbyterian?
Yeah, things are going very well from a vaccination standpoint with our staff. If I look at our whole population of staff, which includes some who really are, later in the line, we're at up to about 65%. If I look at the front of the line, really the front healthcare workers, approaching 90% now. So similar to what Dr. Corwin is saying. Really, I look at our group of employees not that much different than the rest of the population, other than I think we have higher numbers in the earlier group, which is, there's a group of people who just run as fast as they can to get the vaccine. There's a group of people who take a little bit of a wait and see attitude. And then there's a group of people who are highly concerned, highly skeptical, and even among them, across our community, some who are actively anti-vaccine, unfortunately. We have higher percentages in the earlier groups within a hospital system, I think, than the general public. So what we saw was an emotional time where people just were so happy to begin getting the vaccine. Put it in perspective, we've now vaccinated over 36,000 people. Now, Texas went a little different than most states. And so Texas opened up a 1B population that is anyone 65 and up, or 16 to 64 with a health condition. And very early on, a little bit after Christmas, gave us the green light to say, look, don't leave things in your freezer. If you have people, if you have vaccine in your freezer because you can't get enough people in the 1A group that quickly, start vaccinating 1B. And that was a great decision. And one of the reasons Texas leads the country now in the number of people vaccinated.
Let's pursue the question of people who might be resisting it. Do you have a sense of how extensive that population is? And I guess what I'm really talking about is if we need to get to 70 to 80% vaccinated to get to the so-called herd immunity, can we get there? Or is there a large enough percentage of the population to resist that it might interfere with that?
I'm an optimist. I think we can get there. I mean, when you look at most public studies, and the numbers actually been going up as people see experience, you've got 60 to 70, maybe 75% indicating willingness to get a vaccine, in the various studies with some trending upward. I have no doubt that as people see how safe these vaccines are, as we get all these people vaccinated, that we'll be able to move that. But it will take increasingly more and more work over time. Right now, honestly, it's very schizophrenic. You've got people banging down the door saying, I want vaccine yesterday, and not nearly enough vaccine to give it to them. And then a whole other group of people, obviously, who will actively resist it at some point. So I think that will shift over time. But I think we'll also see many people taking a wait and see attitude. Nationwide, I think the numbers are somewhere around 6.5 million people have received a vaccine. Certainly what I've seen internally is we've vaccinated, probably 17,000 of our employees right now. The others are looking, okay, if it worked pretty well for them, I think it can work well for me. And we're letting that kind of process bubble on through as we move forward.
Address that thing that you just averted to, which is maybe there won't be enough vaccine in some situations. How is that working at this point? Is there a bottleneck? Are you feeling a shortage right now of vaccine to put into people's arms?
Oh, no question. I think, what is coming in from the federal government to the state level and then being distributed, I think actually rapid, good distribution models from the state out to individual entities around our state. While there may be some backlog in some of those, I think largely the issue is most of us are sitting there saying, as soon as you can, please give us more. We'll get it in people's arms quickly. We've been highly effectively at Houston Methodist getting vaccine into people literally within days of, a weekly bolus coming in, so that every week it's kind of biting your nails, hoping that the next batch will come in. Recently, the state pivoted a little bit and decided to really focus on large sites, given the constraints in supply. So, for example, in the greater Houston area with about 7.2 million residents, there's only 3 sites this week that have large quantities of vaccine, and it's the city of Houston, the county of Harris County, and Houston Methodist, all of us working hard to vaccinate everybody we can as quickly as we can, and are doing that very effectively right now.
Given that situation, does it make sense to actually distribute all the vaccine and not worry about holding on to the second dose? Because some people are saying, listen, don't hold on to the second dose, get as many jabs into arms as possible, and we'll just catch up on the manufacturing.
Yeah, I think there's sort of 2 parts to that. There's been a lot of discussion about holding off on the second dose altogether. We don't believe that's the right way to go. The science doesn't support that. Now, there's nothing magical about day 21, for example, for Pfizer, or day 28 from Moderna. There's definitely some flex in that, but not to the extent that we know scientifically that the UK has done. The other question in that really is, what the federal program started doing is saying, hey, if we delivered 10,000 doses to you that first week, we're just hanging on to 10,000 in our freezer. It will show up 3 weeks later. And that's that's exactly what's happened for our first, second dose week that has come in. If you have visibility in the supply chain, I'm quite sure there's a way to optimize that better, where more is being distributed quickly, let the manufacturing increase, et cetera. I don't have that kind of visibility, but I know there are very smart, it's kind of a basic business school exercise in optimization. And there's clearly a way to do that. You need to hold some back, I'm quite sure, but probably not a matched program. And that could accelerate things on the front end as well.
How much visibility, Dr. Broome, do you have into what is likely to change once there's a Biden administration in place? I mean, he's got a team. I know they're working on it really hard. Do you have a sense of how things might change come January 20?
I've read the same articles you've read. I mean, about the only substantive thing I know is they've talked about changing that very thing that you and I were just talking about. And, I think this is a process that everybody is learning from, optimizing, and part of optimization is, relooking at decisions that have been made and whether they could be done differently. So I don't know if that's a Biden versus Trump administration issue as much as just learning after a few weeks. And I don't have any visibility past that.
So listen, I know you're not clairvoyant. I'm not going to ask you to predict the future, but you have some sense of what's going on in Texas. Clearly, the cases have continued to increase in much of the country, perhaps because of the holidays. From where you sit, where do you think we're likely to peak in terms of time, and when do you think we're likely to really start to come back down off of this?
Yeah, I'll speak to a Houston that I know the best, but I think it's analogous. I think we've, by and large, in many markets, some may have already peaked, but in many have several weeks of growth still. We haven't seen the full effect of the holidays. I can tell you our modeling in Houston is we've got another few weeks. And eventually the vaccines will be a countervailing force and really help bring this down. But realistically, that's mid to end of February, I think, before we even see those really affecting things. I mean, if you think about it, even the people who got vaccine the first day that it arrived in our hospital system are only getting to week 4, which is when the fully immune period is tomorrow. And that's obviously a small cadre of individuals at this point in time. So really to get even what's been distributed now kicking in, creating immunity is into February. And again, as that heightens through the population, most of the models I've seen do show things starting to get a lot better, certainly by second quarter. So really my big urging to everybody is, look, the vaccines aren't going to be what turn the curve anytime in the near future. We have to all hunker down, be extra careful, get us through this curve. Because once this curve peaks, the likelihood, barring some horrible scenario like a mutation that changes the efficacy of the vaccine, this should be it. It doesn't mean it's over. Don't get me wrong. It's going to take months and months and months to kind of work itself out of the system. But we should be on the down course from then, mostly, throughout the country as we continue to vaccinate. Critically important that everybody get the vaccine.
Doctor, it's always so helpful to talk with you. Thank you for your time. That's Dr. Mark Broome. He's CEO of Houston Methodist. Coming up, Courtney Rosenberger, Strategas Director of Policy Research. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, the House of Representatives had a short session today to address the issue of a resolution on the 25th Amendment. In the meantime, they're also talking about possible article singular, of impeachment. And for a report on exactly what's going on in Washington about getting President Trump out of office, we turn to Bloomberg Chief Washington Correspondent. He is Kevin Zerilli. So, Kevin, where are we?
Likely there's going to be an impeachment vote, David, on Wednesday in the House of Representatives. But as you have alluded to, a lot of questions swirling about the process in terms of the path forward over the next 9 days plus some hours until President-elect Joe Biden is sworn in at 1 p.m. Eastern on January 20th. The articles of impeachment would then, as we know, set up for there to be a Senate trial. The legal question that is openly being discussed virtually as we have this conversation, David, is whether or not there could be an impeachment trial for current President Donald Trump after he leaves office. Now, it's an open debate, but legal scholars are saying, yes, in fact, that could happen. Meanwhile, the issue of the 25th Amendment, which is entirely separate than the issue of impeachment, based upon reporting that I gathered last week, Republicans feel quite simply their words that there is not enough time to carry out the 25th Amendment, and that's why they're going through the channels of there being another impeachment proceeding. Leader McConnell has been incredibly tight-lipped in terms of the impeachment trial, whether or not that would happen. But as it was explained to me over the past 4 to 5 days by multiple sources, a trial similarly to the judicial space is important to get things on record, to conduct investigations, to have things and evidence submitted for the record, and that's the process. So there is a process that is outlined by the Constitution, though it has never been tested, that is on display right now around the clock as we speak.
The one thing we know for sure, it's not going to be a quiet last full week for the Trump administration. I think it's fair to say. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Kevin Cirilli. And you want to listen to his program, Sound Down. That airs at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Radio. President-elect Biden on Friday said that this week he will be proposing a stimulus package with a price tag that will be in the trillions of dollars, he said. To take us through what we should expect, we welcome now Courtney Rosenberger. She is Strategas Director of Policy Research. So great to have you with us, Courtney. What do you anticipate, given now that we know who's going to be sitting in the Senate?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So obviously a 50-50 Senate completely changed the calculation in our view on stimulus. We went from thinking that the last $900 billion package was really the last we were going to get with a Republican Senate. So now we're thinking that they're probably going to have to take a two-phase approach, both using reconciliation because they didn't do a fiscal year 2021 budget. So they can do two reconciliation packages this year. The first package, a lot more focused on income replacement, and then the second package, that larger, potentially into the trillions of dollars package that looks at climate, infrastructure, education, and other priorities.
So take the first one first, if you could, Courtney. $2,000 payments and also money for state and local government?
Yeah, so we're thinking that it's actually going to end up around $1,400 payments, kind of bridging the difference between the $600 checks and the last package. Money for state and local governments, potentially even some money for enhanced unemployment benefits. Obviously, Democrats in the last package wanted to get it to $600 per week in benefits, and they settled at $300 per week in benefits. And then we also think that increased money for vaccine distribution will be included as well. So we're anticipating that that package, when it's all said and done, is going to be around $700 billion.
Will they have any Republican support for that? Because some of the Republicans were outspoken in saying they wanted the 2,000, right?
Yeah, so it'll be interesting. Initially, it was looking like potentially they wouldn't have to use a reconciliation package to get that through. If they can get it through without using a reconciliation package, I'm sure that they'll try, but they have reconciliation as a backup, which is, if they have all 50 Democrats and then Vice President Harris casting the deciding 51st vote. Yeah,
just to be clear for our audience, the difference is, I understand it, Courtney, between reconciliation and not is if it's not reconciliation, they need the 60 votes to get past the filibuster, whereas it's reconciliation package, it's 51 votes will do it.
Yes, and there's very specific provisions that can be included in reconciliation. They have to have direct spending and revenue implications. They can't touch Social Security, and there's a limited number of reconciliation bills that they can do per fiscal year.
So we had a harrowing experience, all of us, the entire country did last week. In your judgment, will that affect, going forward, the politics of things like stimulus?
Well, it could certainly affect, to your last question, Republican support. So going forward with an impeachment vote is probably going to hurt some Republican support for future stimulus packages and kind of, helping get Biden's agenda over the finish line. Normally when a new president enters office, they have, some political leeway where the other party gives them some support for their primary packages, and going through another impeachment vote could endanger that.
Well, that's the question. If they actually went to a trial in the Senate, doesn't that actually preclude other business by Congress while they're going through that trial?
Yeah, and that's why you're starting to hear discussion about potentially introducing the impeachment after the first 100 days. So we're anticipating, for that first stimulus package, that $700 billion package, that would be pretty immediate. We're thinking, around February. So they would be able to get that through before they went through the impeachment process in the Senate.
Does that basically take up their first 100 days? In addition, obviously, to confirming the Senate confirming various appointments and things.
Yeah, so it's certainly, I think, the top priority for the first 100 days. Obviously, the Biden administration has talked about other priorities that they have, things like immigration. I think you're still going to see a lot in terms of, regulatory and executive orders, in terms of reversing what some of the Trump administration has done that Biden can do unilaterally without Congress.
Okay, thank you so much, Courtney. That was very helpful. That's Courtney Rosenberger. She's Director of Policy Research at Strategas. Coming up, sanctions are still being traded back and forth between the United States and China. We talk with Ashton of the U.S. China Business Council. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. The closing days of the Trump administration have not eased tensions between the United States and China, with the U.S. last week moving to delist some Chinese telecom companies, and China over the weekend announcing measures to permit U.S. multinationals to be held liable for complying with U.S. sanctions. To explain where things stand, insofar as we know, we welcome now Anna Ashton. She is U.S. China Business Council Vice President for Government Affairs. So, Anna, thank you. It's always great to have you with us. What do we know about what China did over the weekend in response to this delisting?
So thanks for having me. And what we know about what China did, frankly, we're still kind of trying to piece it together and understand the implications. But the rules apply when extraterritorial application of foreign legislation or other measures unjustifiably, in China's mind, prohibits or restricts Chinese citizens and organizations from engaging in normal economic, trade, and related activities with a third state or its citizens or other organizations. So it actually may be a somewhat narrower scope than it seemed like over the weekend. There are important questions that remain regarding the scope and the applications of the rules, but they do potentially create compliance concerns for multinational companies that are seeking to navigate the, always multiplying, it seems, set of rules and restrictions governing commercial activity between the U.S. and China.
So Anna, take a broader view here for me for a second. We have a new administration coming in next week, January 20. Do we have any sense of the extent to which President Biden, when he is president, will continue some of the policies of President Trump or will veer away from them? There's some speculation that some of the things that President Trump has done sort of points Mr. Biden into a corner.
Definitely. I mean, I think we need to start with the fact that the Biden campaign talking points on China were, pretty aggressive. There is a Biden administration coming into office that has every intention, has clearly expressed every intention of being tougher on China than the Obama administration or administrations prior to the Obama administration. So this isn't going to be, rolling back Trump policies towards China writ large. And on top of that, we have to assume that domestic priorities are going to take center stage when the Biden administration assumes power. So they're going to be dealing with the pandemic and economic fallout from the pandemic first and foremost. Yes, I think that we may see changes in the approach to China. I think we should expect changes. But some of these things are going to have bipartisan support, and they're going to be difficult to roll back. And we know, for instance, that we're not going to see tariffs lifted all at once or right away. So I think that we need to move forward, assuming that some of these executive orders are also going to remain in place, at least for the time being. And the question will just be, will their implementation and application be more nuanced than what we would see under a second Trump term?
As you talk to members of the U.S. business community doing business in China, is there anything approaching a broad consensus of what they would like to see out of a Biden administration when it comes to China?
Fundamentally, they want to see more predictability, more transparency. They want to be able to operate in an environment that they understand, that they know what it's going to be like 6 months down the road, a year down the road. And we haven't had that for the last few years. So that's the number one most important thing to business. And then I think the second thing is that the vast majority of companies that we talk to, and granted, we're a self-selected group of companies that do business in China and want to continue to do business in China, but it's a big group. They want there to be an emphasis on finding solutions to our challenges in our bilateral relationship that don't unnecessarily infringe on our ability to engage commercially.
They want things out of the U.S. government, as you say, predictability, certainty that they don't feel perhaps they've had for the last 4 years. Are there things that they want out of the Chinese government? Are there areas in which they say, you know what, President Trump wasn't altogether wrong. We do need the Chinese government to make some adjustments in how they do business?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, most companies did support the Phase 1 trade agreement, and they supported it because it did move the ball forward on a number of challenges that had thwarted business desires in the China market for quite some time. They want to see that agreement continue to be enforced, and they want to see the next administration move forward towards negotiations on the outstanding issues that were supposed to be taken up with a phase 2 dialogue. So, a continued focus on market opening and fair competition, especially.
Some of those issues, as you know so well, Anna, are terribly difficult. Things like state-owned enterprises, subsidies from the government, government ownership of businesses, and also, goodness knows, tech. Is there hope that, in fact, we could come to some understanding of the Chinese? They're not going to change their system just to be like ours, but is there hope that we could come to some sort of understanding?
I think it remains to be seen exactly what kind of relationship the Biden administration and the Chinese government are able to establish in terms of whether or not we can see some positive developments, whether it comes to state-owned enterprises or tech engagement. But those are both really tricky issues, and they're ones where we have increasingly asserted pretty strong positions, and the Chinese government has asserted its own strong positions that are counter to ours. So we have some difficult work ahead of us.
Without a doubt. And what do you think about the team that President Biden is putting into place?
We wish them well, and I think there are a lot of people on that team that have deep experience, and we're hopeful that we can work together with them, as well as policymakers on the Hill, to navigate the process of articulating a new China strategy for the 21st century.
Okay, well, come back and tell us how it goes. Thank you so much to Anna Ashton of the U.S. China Business Council. Coming up, we're going to have a second hour of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio. We're going to talk with former Democratic Senator from Alaska, Mark Broome, about attempts to remove President Trump from office. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.